Good morning. We're going to go ahead and start, and the latecomers won't know all the extremely important things I'm about to say. Thank you all for coming. I'm Catherine Rafelson with SID-Washington, and this is our panel on messaging. And I just want to say before I introduce our moderator that I touched on this, I think, this morning. I can't even remember if I touched on it, but some of you may not have been there, so I'll say it again. We're doing a little bit of an experiment today with the morning panels, with this one and the one next door, where after this panel ends at approximately 12:30, you'll have the option of joining a breakout session within the room. We'll have 3 breakout sessions, and they're meant to be small, so we're assuming not everybody will join them. And we have facilitators and scribes from PwC who are going to help facilitate discussions about what our panelists say here and delve down into a couple of key questions to get your input really beyond the usual Q&A that we'll have at the end of the formal panel. So after this ends, Ellen will remind everybody you can look for a SID volunteer. We'll have one in that corner, one in that corner, and one over here, and just go there and pull chairs around and join this discussion, and we'll see what comes of it. Your other option is to have an extended networking break before lunch and see our exhibit halls, and I'm sure you'll all find things to do, but I hope some of you will plan to join those discussions. So I want to introduce our moderator, Ellen Yount. Ellen is Vice President of Public Affairs for MSI, a Tetra Tech company, and she's been at MSI in a number of positions for many years. You can read her full bio on our app, but she's also headed up communications for a variety of organizations. She's been on the government side, she's been at the House, she's been at USAID, she's been with IRI. She comes at communications from every angle, which is perfect for this discussion. And Ellen also was a SID-Washington board member and co-chair of our communications committee with Jeff Grieco, who's here. So to me, she's a communications guru, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, that's a lofty introduction. Thank you for that, guru. So again, I'm Ellen Yount. I'm with MSI, a Tetra Tech company, and I'm Vice President for Public Affairs. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in a minute, but I want to give you a little bit of context for today's discussion. So first of all, I'm just really pleased that we're having this discussion. I mean, it's one of 4 breakout panels, and I think that speaks to the importance and the imperative of messaging in this environment. So if you looked at the description, we're here today to talk about the discipline of effectively communicating the programmatic impact and overarching results of foreign assistance investments. That sounds pretty lofty. What we're really going to talk about is messaging, messenger, a little bit about how do we build a broader constituency. I hope that we're going to get into audience and tactics. And then the elephant in the room for me has always been on this issue: where's the money? Where's the budget? If we're serious about this as part of a development discipline, if we feel the imperative to explain foreign assistance to the American public and in the countries where our development programs are taking place, we have to put our money where our mouth is. And that's been one of the things really, I think, holding back. We have good news, and I'll talk about that, to report on development communications, but there's a lot that has held us back. So I'm looking out at the audience. I see a lot of communications professionals here. I'm looking forward to your questions. We're going to spend probably about a half an hour or 40 minutes up here as a panel, and I'll have the prerogative as the moderator, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. Let's see, where to start. I don't think I need to remind anyone here about the cuts to the state and USAID funding in the FY18 administration proposal. I was thinking about it coming into this panel. You know, we're all familiar with the 3 Ds of development, defense, and diplomacy, but I think there are also 3 Ds that have been mentioned in terms of this budget: draconian, disastrous, and dangerous, right? So those are the new 3 Ds for me. So it would be easy to get discouraged. I think particularly here inside the Beltway, it would be very easy to get discouraged about what's happening with the international affairs budget and potentially reorganization. But I don't think that has to be the case. In fact, some are thinking that this is an opportunity for us to broaden the constituency around aid and foreign assistance. So I want to start off with the good news, and I went back and I looked at the USAID exit memo. I don't know if many of you read that document. It was a pretty compelling document. I mentioned to former Administrator Gail Smith that I was going to be quoting from it this morning. So let me quote, because here's what it said. Quote, "Having reduced poverty, malnutrition, and mortality, all while spurring entrepreneurship and innovation, empowering women and girls, and helping to build more sustainable, more stable, accountable, and inclusive partners for the United States, whether we are combating hunger, preventing the spread of deadly diseases, or increasing access to education and clean energy, we," referring to USAID, "are achieving real results that change people's lives for the better, despite the often harsh realities of the world in which we live." That's a pretty great overview, right? We know the statistics. We've heard them. We've all been in a lot of panels, whether it's cutting extreme poverty by more than half since 1990, reducing the number of child deaths, number of countries that have graduated from low income to middle income status. There is very good news that we can talk about. But we also know that challenges remain. We know that development gains have been uneven. Dan Runde and Gail and Peter McPherson referred to fragile states this morning, something that we know is a major challenge for all of us in the development community. We know that still some 700 or 800 million people are living in poverty. And we are all familiar with those headlines around development. We've seen the bad headlines: the school that doesn't get built, the school that collapses, the road that goes to nowhere, or the road that deteriorates, corruption amongst local officials. We also know, sorry to remind you, that polling consistently shows that Americans don't understand that we spend less than 1/10 of 1% on the budget. Polling consistently shows over and over again that Americans think we spend between 30 and 35% of the budget, if we were only so lucky to spend that amount on foreign aid. In 2016, prior to the election, in a Pew Research Center poll, a majority of Americans said, "We'll deal with our problems, you deal with yours." And I would suspect that in some parts of the United States, and I think my panelists would probably agree with this, that given the rise in anti-globalism in certain parts around immigration, refugee resettlement, trade agreements, participation in multilateral organizations, that those numbers might be even higher. So I'm not going to end on a negative note, because I think I'm an optimistic person, and I think there is reason for optimism. One of the biggest reasons for optimism we heard about this morning, and that is that strong bipartisan, nonpartisan consensus that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years emanating from Congress. Who'd have thunk it? I think it was USGLC that referred to the congressional committees dealing with foreign aid and diplomacy as oases of bipartisan cooperation. There aren't too many ways and places you can say that on Capitol Hill, and we'll hear from Les Munson about that in a minute. We've also seen that some of the most vocal opponents of the FY18 budget proposal for the international affairs budget have been prominent foreign policy Republicans, folks like Bob Corker and Ed Royce and Lindsey Graham. The FY17 omnibus, I also took great encouragement in that. We have to remember that that was an increase over the FY16 levels, a lot of funding in there for humanitarian assistance. Again, I don't think many of us would have predicted that the FY17 omnibus would actually include an increase. That was pretty incredible. We've seen military, faith-based business leaders really raise their voices in an unprecedented fashion over the FY18 budget. So now as a community, one of the things that we're here to talk about today is how do we raise our voices effectively around soft power? How do we show that we are achieving results? We have achieved results, that we're cost efficient, that we're open to modernization, and that that's not just helping those people and those beneficiaries in the developing countries where we work and where we're passionate about doing work, but it makes a difference here at home, because we know that it does. So we've tried to assemble a panel that's really going to give a 360-degree perspective. Let me just introduce them briefly. We're not going to do opening statements. We're just going to get right into the questions. So I'm going to start with the man in the middle. I'm going to start with Les Munson, my old friend and colleague from USAID. I've known Les for a long time, and I think he's a familiar face to many of you in the development community. A 26-year career on Capitol Hill. He knows his corridors around the House and Senate. After a 26-year career on Capitol Hill, he joined BGR International, Most recently on the Hill, he served as staff director for Chairman Bob Corker from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Les and I were actually at USAID at the same time. I won't mention what year that was. We were talking about that with Maura and Stephanie earlier, but during that time, he was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Legislative Affairs and also worked on a number of global health issues. And I think Les is going to bring a particularly insightful perspective to our conversation this morning about the Hill. To my left is Stephanie Bluma. Stephanie and I also had the opportunity to work together at USAID. She served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Public Affairs for the last 3 years. And what's very interesting about Stephanie is, given her background in the private sector, she spent 13 years with Weber Shandwick, a large public relations firm. She really brought a very different orientation to the storytelling exercise at USAID in terms of humanizing the story. We're going to hear from Stephanie about that in a minute. She was there during some very challenging crises, the Syrian refugee crisis, the Ebola crisis, and also has a Hill background, having worked for Senator Tom Daschle. And finally, Maura Wieland. Maura was most recently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Digital. So again, Maura has a varied background, both at Homeland Security. She also served as DAA at USAID. She's currently a partner at Blue Dot Strategies. She's utilized new technologies alongside traditional communications methodologies to grow audiences and to have impact. And so again, I think she will have a quite interesting perspective to bring to the table. Okay, so with that, we are going to get into some of the questions that we have prepared. And I think the most obvious one is one that we touched on this morning with the former USAID Administrators panel, which is out to all of you. In an America First era in which the OMB director has said that this is a budget that prioritizes programs not according to the number of people they serve, but by whether or not they can be justified to a family in Grand Rapids, Michigan, how would you go about reframing the development and humanitarian assistance message? And I don't think any of you are from Grand Rapids, but if you are, you can go first. Who would like to start? Let's think a little bit about reframing to the American public in this era. Stephanie, you want to start?
I'm not from Michigan. I'm from Nebraska, so
okay, well,
it
that
may count.
will suffice.
The first thing I would say is I don't really know how to message to a hypothetical family. I think one of the most important things we can do as communicators is to really understand who our audience is and think about who we're communicating to. So in the spirit of the question, I will tell you how I would message to my family, which I know very well, back in Nebraska and some in South Dakota. And the first thing I would say is we have to show and not tell. We talk about telling our story. In the question, we're going to tell our story, but then we end up with measurable impacts and technical terms where we think we're talking about what we're doing, but no one actually understands what we're saying. So we hopefully can talk about this more later, but really getting into the storytelling aspect of it. And when I mean that, I mean, you have characters, you sometimes have bad guys, you have narratives, those narratives that are in everyone's head to use to explain this. I think that's critical, especially when we're talking about a broader American audience. The second thing I would mention is just fairness. We talk a lot about fairness and different things, and I think it's a theme when I go home and talk to my family members, some of which are Republicans, some of which are Democrats, some in the middle. The idea that everyone gets a fair shot resonates quite a bit. So I think trying to weave in fairness, I know we talked to it as American values, but really talking about what those values are, I think has a more powerful result. And the third thing, and Gail touched on this a little bit this morning, but just the idea that we need friends, and what does it mean to be a friend? So what does it mean to be in an alliance? What does it mean to be a friend and have friends who support you? I think that's something most people will resonate with. I think America First, great, I guess that means we're winning. I'm not sure what it means, but I think the idea of people working together and those basic ideas of helping out your neighbors, I think are even stronger in this environment.
Okay, Les, do you want to take a shot at it next?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and make a naked pitch for what U.S. Global Leadership Coalition is doing, and in total disclosure, I work with them in my current job, but I think they do a terrific job of hitting on the three issues that really matter for Americans: national security, our economic interests, and our humanitarian interests. And if you've ever done one of the door knocks on Capitol Hill with USGLC or with someone else, and you've walked in with someone who's just served in uniform in Iraq to make the case for the international affairs budget, and you see how the staffer across the table suddenly puts their hands down, makes eye contact, focuses on what the message is. It's transformative. And so, to roll in with the allies of foreign assistance, the natural allies in the defense community, and also in the diplomatic community, but really right now for most Americans who identify with the U.S. military, which is by far the most popular institution we have in this country, is really a critical element of everything we're doing. And I think as we think about the future of the 150 account, which we have to do now given the current circumstances, it's from everything from messaging in a small meeting like that to big picture stuff. We need to think about the relationship with the Defense Department and how collaborative it is and how cooperative it can be and how we can achieve our goals by collaborating directly with folks in uniform.
Okay, Maura?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what people said. I think, but backing up 1 minute, I think we also need to recognize that even though we are in a crisis in terms of the policy challenges, the messaging, we have to admit, has worked. We have, over the past 15 years, the work this entire community has done has changed that dynamic by leading with these 3 principles of economic security and altruism or humanitarian. And so I think the first thing to remember is let's not go searching in the night for the thing that's going to change minds. Let's do more of the things that we know work. So I think first sticking on that one. The other thing I would say is, we operate in a space where we have very little real polling and very little real understanding of what people actually do think about these issues. It's just not polled at the same rate that things like healthcare or employment or education are polled on. So I'm just referring back to a lot of the polling I had access to because I helped on the last election. And, I want to reflect on one thing Gail got at a little bit is, fear works. And making sure that people are a little scared of what might happen if we allow these things to atrophy can be very effective. And one of the frames we saw really work and is still, we find very effective in terms of convincing people is an understanding of teaching people that these things, these small steps, these little bits of eroding the system we build will lead to war. And it may be war in other countries, it may be war, that Americans are committed to, but even a war that Americans don't commit to has an impact on our economy. Mm-hmm. The last thing I would just say is to recognize the space we're in, which is, we're not in a pre-election season, we're not in, kind of the rush of political dialogue. And this becomes then probably one of the most important times to have this conversation because the temperature is down a little bit in terms of people are more open-minded, they're open to listening to different perspectives. And I think that coupled with the fact that, you go across the country and you see a heightened awareness of what's happening in Washington and a heightened concern, we have an audience that's willing to hear our message in a new way, and we need to take advantage of that.
Okay, let me just push back on one of those things a little bit, and that's on the altruism, because I think that does play very well into the hinterlands. And I grew up in a very small town in western Pennsylvania. When I was working on Capitol Hill for an unknown congressman by the name of Tom Ridge many years ago, and trying to explain the balanced budget amendment and the line item veto, I always thought of my 75-year-old grandmother living in a small town in western Pennsylvania, living on a budget, and I thought, how would I explain this to her, right? But so you can use some of that same parallel for humanitarian assistance. When you're out there in the hinterlands and you say, oh, USAID helps save people's lives after an earthquake, or we came in after a tsunami in Southeast Asia, that's something that people, I think, can very easily relate to, and that makes them feel very good about their investment. But isn't it a bit trickier on the development side when you're telling people that we're working in this country to strengthen the legislature, we're working with the anti-corruption agency, we're assisting with elections? Aren't those things a little bit tougher to message?
Yes.
Yes, right.
And we all know that. And I think Lindsey Graham did sum it up. I think we all have it tattooed on our arm of national security insurance. But I think we have to also be a little self-aware that one of the reasons that it is tough to message is it's often tough for development professionals to put it in a national security frame. We're hesitant to say, this is for security, and standing with people in the military and saying that and allowing them to be our messengers is somewhat, where there's still a cultural allergy to that in a lot of ways. And I think as we get more integrated with the 3Ds, as we see these trade-offs happening, that's diminishing. But, I would just raise the self-awareness that some of that is self-imposed.
Les, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think we all need to get a little bit outside of our comfort zone on the issues we talk about. One of the things that clearly mattered in the last election was refugee policy and folks coming into this country from abroad. There's a gigantic crisis in Syria, almost historical proportion that's been unfolding before our eyes for 6 years. U.S. assistance is directly related to containing the damage from Syria in the sense that the more people we help in Syria or in neighboring countries, the fewer people come here. It's a very delicate issue. A lot of us are uncomfortable talking about refugee policy, or we've got real concerns about where the current administration is. But we shouldn't be shy about pointing out that it's our dollars in the 150 account that go towards mitigating those crises, which can bring down the temperature of all of these very sensitive political issues. So we have to get a little bit outside of our comfort zone on that, on our partnership with the military and these other things during this time of change.
Okay. Stephanie, anything to add?
I mean, I agree with all of that. I will say on Syria, because that was an issue we were dealing with at USAID, and I know Maura was dealing with it at the State Department at the same time. It was really hard for people to understand the issue because there weren't a lot of names and faces necessarily associated with it, and there were a lot of sort of negative thoughts. I remember going home, and I had actually been to one of the camps in Jordan, and everyone's like, well, they're all trying to come to America. So that's not the case. So we really tried to actually use some storytelling techniques to get across, and one of the most popular videos we did was actually about a Jordanian teacher who was taking in Syrian students, even though she didn't have room for them in her school. And that was well over 1 million views, got tons of engagement. NBC News picked it up. I mean, that was one of it was just a small example, but sort of trying to explain to people what this aid money is actually helping do on the ground. That was a lot easier to communicate that way than for me to go and say, like, we're giving this much money to WFP, but they may run out, and then we'll have to, try and fill it from here. It was just a much simpler way to engage people in the story.
Okay. All right, let's come at this from a little bit of a different angle. There was an article this week, an op-ed written by a colleague of ours in the development industry, where he actually said that reframing the narrative around America First is all wrong, that we should not be reframing it that way, that it actually undermines our partnership in the world, that if we aren't convincing those who we work with around the world that we're genuinely trying to help them build more inclusive, accountable societies, that we're really undermining ourselves if we're leading with the national self-interest argument, that they'll have little incentive. So this may be a little bit about audience, right? And I think that's a bit of the challenge that people have with some of this narrative, that there's one narrative for the American audience that might work around economic growth or altruism, but when you're out implementing programs, if you lead Chin First with American First, that can be very detrimental to getting buy-in. So do you agree with this point? And where would you strike the balance? Or does it, again, depend on the audience that you're talking to? I think we would all agree, yes, that it does. But where do you strike that balance? Not completely politicizing the message. I mean, to your point, Maura, it's not like the national security angle is new. I mean, this is something that's been part of the narrative. It was a narrative under the Obama administration. So how do you strike that balance between America First and then staying true to what we have always tried to follow out in the field, which is local ownership, local partnership, inclusiveness, accountability? Where's that balance?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think I don't agree with the op-ed.
You don't? Okay.
I think we're creating problems for ourselves. I recall, and I might be wrong about this, remind me, Jeff, I'm pretty sure McCain, when he was the Republican nominee in 2008, campaigned on country first, was his slogan. I think I had a bumper sticker that said country first. And he's very much a globalist and an internationalist, but he was still able to say country first. America First doesn't, and I'm not, going to go around giving speeches in favor of the Trump policy on this or anything, but country first doesn't have to mean, or America First doesn't have to mean a bad thing. If you look back at last week, the president went to Europe. and talked about our allies making more of a contribution to NATO. Yet he came back here and was seen as undermining the alliance. Frankly, I could understand why some people saw the body language as undermining the alliance, but the message of, hey, everyone else needs to pay up like we are, actually strengthens the alliance. Let's see opportunities in the current situation. When we're talking about the hypothetical family in Michigan or the small town in Pennsylvania, those are the swing voters that are going to matter in 2020. Those are the people that the current president's campaign are going to be speaking to, and presumably the nominee from the other party are going to be speaking to, because the Democrats are going to win back those voters. So we should be thinking about talking to them, and whether it's how you talk to a member from that area or some family, we need to connect with them in the things that matter, and explaining things in terms of how it can benefit our country. I think can be helpful, and I don't think it really hurts us that much with our partners abroad. They understand the changes that we're going through. We're seeing these similar changes in a lot of other countries anyway. Some of them were already there before we got here. So I don't think we should be too worried about the America First message. We don't have to go whole hog on it, but let's see it as an opportunity to talk about issues that matter.
Okay, interesting perspective. Maura?
I think we have 2 proof points already that if Rex Tillerson is actually going to be a data-driven secretary would cause him to stop the America First rhetoric in its tracks. We can all agree that we haven't seen many substantive changes in these past months from the Trump administration on foreign policy and on the budget yet, but we have 2 points of demonstrable evidence of the America First rhetoric causing direct and real harm, and that is in tourism, which is down about 50% coming to the United States. That is annually, I think it's a $40 billion budget in the United States, and that employs, waitresses and hotel workers, not necessarily, major corporations. These are real people that are going to suffer. And those decisions aren't just coming out of Muslim countries. There are demonstrable and significant drops from European tourism coming to the United States. And when polled, people are saying that it's Trump and his rhetoric. The second point is enrollment at our universities. Again, one of America's greatest exports, one of the core components of our soft power in the world is our enrollment in American universities. Those students also, again, billions contributed to the US budget. That enrollment down about 50%. Interestingly, Canada is seeing a rise in the number of international students going there. So it's not a drop off in desire to study abroad, it's desire to study here. And again, that all happened as a result of the way Donald Trump is talking about the world in this America First way. I will take your point that, speaking about American interests publicly has happened in a bipartisan way. Probably one of the greatest examples is as the Obama administration was pushing trade deals, I often got into a back and forth with USTR that wanted to know why state wasn't retweeting the Create American Jobs messages they were putting out, and we had to sort of educate them that, the millions of people that read our information around the world want to hear about partnerships, and they want to hear about working together, not about creating American jobs. But I will agree with you, a lot of people around the world are familiar with our Congress. They get our system, frankly, better than a lot of people who work at state and AID do. They're willing to tolerate a certain amount of it. But I do think that we already have evidence that the rhetoric, and isolated only the rhetoric, is what's harming U.S. policy.
I'll just add to that. I think it gets difficult when you try and have 2 messages. If we have a message here of America First, and then we're trying to give a different message in countries. When I look at our social media feeds, there are a huge amount of people, particularly from Pakistan and Afghanistan, that follow the U.S. social media channels. So once we try and bifurcate this message, if I was sitting upstairs, I can hear my phone ringing from all the communicators in the field, just not knowing what to do if we're doing this. So I think we have to make it possible for us to, I don't think we have to back away from it entirely, but we have to be practical about what are they going to do with this in the field, if they're going to do anything with it.
Right, and that's a big challenge, and we are hearing that from a lot of communications folks out in the hinterlands. Okay, I'm going to turn this a little bit. I want to talk to Les a bit about, again, one of the beacons of hope, which is Capitol Hill. We have convinced Capitol Hill. This community has convinced them that soft power and foreign assistance is a smart investment. And I love this quote from Ted Yoho that I pulled up. USGLC, to Les's point, they have aggregated a list, 200 different quotes from members of the House and Senate, and I read them last night. These quotes are amazing, pushing back again on the foreign assistance budget. But I love this one from Ted Yoho. He said, "I was one of the ones who came here 4 years ago to gut foreign aid, but I've become much more learned in my 4 years here. I agree with Secretary Mattis, who said, if you want to cut foreign aid, you're not saving that money because you have to buy more ammunition with it." So, Les, how did the community convince Capitol Hill and key pivotal members of the House and Senate that this was a smart investment? That's the first part of the question. That's probably the easy part. And the second part is, why haven't we been able to translate that argument so convincingly to the American public? And I know that's a very broad question, but let's start with the Hill first. How did we do it?
So for those of you who don't know, Ted Yoho is a Republican from Florida. He's a member of the Freedom Caucus, and he has just become the co-chair of the I think it's the Effective Foreign Aid Caucus.
Okay.
And Adam Smith is the co-chair on the Democrat side. Ted Yoho is an amazing story, and an instructive one, that you can talk to these audiences that you might think are ungettable. You don't. There's no reason you can't go into a Freedom Caucus office with a message of foreign assistance helps our military abroad, foreign assistance helps our American businesses, foreign assistance is directly related to our humanitarian and faith-based instincts as Americans, and make the case. And I would say, based on my only 26 years on the Hill, you're going to be successful about 50% of the time with the Freedom Caucus, which is pretty doggone good. So, by the way, I'm just going to postulate that part of the reason people aren't coming here is because the dollar is so strong. And it's more expensive to come, and it's probably more expensive. And our tuition at our colleges is outrageous. As someone who has 2 kids in high school, I'm very concerned. So I think the Yoho story is a great story, but it behooves us in the community, people who care about the 150 budget, the 150 account, to do the hard work of going to the Hill and telling the story of why this matters, how it helps us, and how it's in kind of the American, in our best impression of ourselves. Yeah. This is an example of us demonstrating the shining city on the Hill. I think we just have to do that work and go to those offices and occasionally get a no.
Yeah. You hear over and over again that one of the things that turns members is codels, right? That these members go out there and they're blown away by a codel in terms of what they see and the small investment that we make. We certainly can't take the entire American public out on a codel, but to Stephanie's point then, how do we show to the American public? How do we really get into the living rooms of the American public and show them what this small investment means? I mean, would you agree that codels really make a huge difference in your experience?
Codels are transformative. If there's anyone here from aid or from state, embracing members of Congress when they travel abroad is critical, even if they're maybe a little too focused on shopping or something like that. The things that they see and the people that they meet make a huge difference. I just want to say one other thing. In addition to Yoho, Mitch McConnell has had at least a couple quotes on that list about how much he supports the current level of funding for the 150 account, which is stunning. If, for those of you who are a little bit on the older side, remember in 1995, it was Senator McConnell, when he was chair of the Foreign Ops Subcommittee in the Senate, who said, we can just zero out aid to Africa. Says, because it doesn't matter, it doesn't help us. He's come so far in about a generation to the point where, and Ted Yoho did it in only 4 years, but the point is, you can change minds. We can make a difference. The current administration proposed budget, which isn't going to be anywhere near what it's really like, doesn't mean we can't deliver those messages.
Okay.
I just quickly want to add, that didn't happen by accident, though. I mean, that was a very dedicated effort of people going to the Hill. I was here for Raj. I was here with Gail. The amount of time that was spent talking to the Hill on the phone, more I was here for some of it. I mean, it was a real concentrated effort that had a lot of support for the community. So it's hard. I think part of the problem is when I look at this is I think, like Maura said, I think the messaging is basically right, but sometimes we do the messaging and then we don't actually get to the execution phase where we're going out and actually making sure people hear the messaging. And I think the Hill is an example of a place where we made sure that these people actually heard the messaging. I don't know that most of the American public has heard any messaging
Right.
on foreign development.
And we'll get to that. Okay, Maura.
I would also say that, I'm a Democrat on this panel, and, we have to watch our back, because what I see in a lot of the conversations happening right now with the resistance and the efforts to, keep the budget intact is that Democrats are retrenching and going back to a schoolhouses here versus schoolhouses over there dynamic. As the threats to things like healthcare increase, education, things like that, those become the legislative priorities, and there becomes less oxygen to spend the time and energy, even for those who are very committed to these issues. So and all of the mentions we've made of members of Congress sitting up here, we've mentioned a lot of Republicans and how, they get it and they get the dynamic, but it is also important to keep talking to Democrats who, are going to be pulled into that dynamic of seeing their communities and prioritizing the communities that they see in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
So more showing for them as well.
Okay. I think we're going to do one more question. I'm going to offer one more question, then we're going to turn it up to the audience. So to this point about the fact, Stephanie, I think raises a very good point, that there was a very concentrated effort on Capitol Hill. And, very captive audience. When you go up to Capitol Hill, you find them in the Longworth or the Dirksen, and you go into their offices, and many of us have gone up and tried to educate the Hill. But in terms of the American public, some of what you tried to do, Stephanie, again, is introduce this video storytelling. Maura, you were very much on the digital side at state and engaging through social media. Tell us a little bit about that effort, and then tell us who were you targeting in the American public, and could you say that it had any impact in terms of changing public opinion around foreign aid?
I'll start. So at USAID, we made some pretty specific campaigns that we focused on key issues that we knew were priorities or that we thought would resonate well with the American people. So we paired that with our storytelling, and we paired it with a smart digital strategy, and we paid a lot of attention to metrics. So our social media following grew 89% over the last 3 years in terms of fans and followers, and it's not a bunch of people in Russia, it's actual real people that are following us, or China. And we really found that the human stories, when we put them on there, had such great engagement rates, and they actually made all the other content better too, because it just sort of changed how we were talking. We weren't up there posting USAID today did X, because people don't identify with the institution, they identify with the issue. So it kind of flipped how we were doing it, and we saw a lot of good traction. So for us, it really had a lot of progress, and we saw some really interesting effects of it. I mentioned NBC covered in one of our stories. We had a great story out of Morocco about 2 young women who were in a workforce program sponsored by USAID, and they learned to be car mechanics. So they finished the workforce development program. They opened a garage, a car shop in Morocco. And we told their story. Those 2 girls are now famous in Morocco. They've been all over the media there. They were invited to the White House. We took them to Capitol Hill and had them brief. And it's really hard to have 2 young women sitting there who have had just a little bit of help and turn into success. It's hard not to support them. They are good validators as well as using other things as well. So it's not just about the video, it's about sort of the whole ecosystem you develop. And I'll just very quickly want to make this point, because I've got asked this question a lot. Equal to telling the story and making content and compelling, you have to execute on it. So the distribution is equally as important. It doesn't do any good to have all of these stories if no one is seeing them. So I won't go into all the details. I'm happy to talk more about it, but we had a very deliberate distribution strategy to make sure that what we were putting out there was actually getting seen.
Okay, Maura.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I can't count how many times people come and say, we have a great video that we put up and no one's watched it. And you're like, well, did you show it to anyone? But key part of that is, one thing that, my time in government was starting at AID and starting a Twitter feed, right? They didn't have one at the time, which was, spoke to a larger challenge of the agency sort of being silenced at that time. So, we really were giving AID a voice back. And that took some time to get to a point where, it gained so many followers. But when I moved over to state and started running the digital platforms, our key was engagement. It wasn't enough for us simply to broadcast. We had the loudest broadcast function of any government agency in the world, except for NASA, interestingly, which has a distribution larger than the White House. We had all of these tools. We had a global, set of PAOs who spoke the local language and could engage. But we found that one of the things we needed to do with digital tools was use it as an opportunity to widen the room, was the phrase we used. We had to take, so it's not enough to do an in-person event with some speaker in a group. Who's on the social media account taking questions from those who can't participate? This was especially important with our program side in the rest of the world, where we often had audiences in hard-to-reach places that, increasingly over time we saw adapt to digital tools. But it worked in the United States as well. One of the things, I'll just give a quick for instance, when the first, sadly we have to talk about them in numbers, the first chemical attack happened in Syria, and the administration was moving to try to get Congress to authorize use of force. The administration did what we do, sent Susan Rice there and, Samantha Power here, and, everyone was speaking to groups. One of the things we did was put John Kerry in front of a Google Plus Hangout. And the reason we did that is because in that short time span, we had like a week and a half to convince America this was a good idea. We obviously see how well we did, but there was no other opportunity for one of our national leaders to get questions from the American public and to answer them directly. And so we facilitated that through this tool because we wanted people to see him, right? Like a Twitter Q&A wasn't personal enough. And, technically it was a lot of like a square peg in a round hole and trying to make this work and how are we going to structure it. And we spent a lot of time on that. But we were really trying to capture that opportunity for engagement that digital tools offer when you can't be in person. So I would think a lot about when we're putting this content out. The reason that's important is we're finding that's how people learn. That's how they absorb. They don't want to be spoken to and lectured at. They want to engage with a person. They want to back and forth. That, if we want our messages to work, we have to give them a chance to engage with it.
And you have to work together. I mean, Maura and I worked together. Unfortunately, a lot of time it was on a crisis response because we had a record number of them. But we also worked with DOD. I worked with NASA. They do have an amazing community. So NASA to talk about the importance of development. So I think it's about everyone sort of amplifying each other's stories and content is what makes it work.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that in the Obama administration, we had, it was sort of informally called the Digital Cabinet. And, we met regularly at the White House, and, you would find the National Endowment for Humanities working with NASA, or the National Park Service we did a lot of work with on travel and tourism around the world to increase travel and tourism to the United States. So it was engaging and using each other's unique audiences, but also, creating those opportunities for people to engage in new ways.
Okay. I have just barely scratched the surface on my questions. That's okay. I want to open it up to all of you. I think we just have one microphone here in the middle. So if you've got some questions, why don't you come on up to the mic? Eric, come on down. There's a lot more we could talk about. So hopefully your question's something on my list.
First time caller, long time fan. Just really curious. This is a great conversation. When we talk about communications, what often comes up is the budget required. And so at ICF, we work with brands as well as federal agencies, and there's a vast difference in what a federal agency is willing to spend to get its message out and engage with its customers and communities versus a brand. Since the trade-off right now is between a lot of the conversations being framed in terms of what we can do for domestically versus internationally, even looking at how we can help the poor kids versus telling that story. I'm just curious how you're able to have those conversations about the costs involved.
Yeah, I'll take that one because I'm aware of what my budget was in the private sector, and I'm aware of what my basically non-existent budget was at USAID. First of all, I think it is a problem. I think we do need to put more money into communications. We did a pilot program, and Ellen's familiar with this, in the Middle East 5 of our missions kind of joining together, where we actually were using targeted paid social media in very strategic ways, and it had a huge impact, even that small little amount that we were able to do, because we were doing what the brands were doing. I also think there's a partnership opportunity there. So if you look at brands today, and especially if you look at the millennial audience, which I know some people don't think should be an audience, I disagree, I think they're a little too big to ignore. They're looking for their brands to have a social conscience, to have awareness. They're looking for ways to connect. So I think all of these partners that we have, and there's a great partners, the Global Development Lab and others, I think there's a unique opportunity to try and combine the two things together if it's done smartly. Not the way Pepsi tried to do it, but I think there are some interesting ways that you can kind of combine those two powers together.
I just want to share one little statistic, because I think it focuses on some of the challenge that aid as an agency faces. So about 10 or 12 years ago, when I was just leaving the agency, we started a training program. We actually stood up communications officers for every USAID mission in the world. At that time, out of the 90-plus missions, there were only 25 communications officers. You compare that to what the public affairs officers have out explaining public diplomacy. Now, I can say that fortunately, aid has built this infrastructure over the last 10 years. It's a strong infrastructure, but let me just give you one example. In Afghanistan, there are 6 USAID information officers. The public affairs section at state has 75 officers, right? So you think about the disparity between the two and how challenging it is. I mean, not even thinking about the American audience and the very severe constraints that Stephanie Amora and others have had at aid in telling the story to the American public. But then when you think about messaging out in the hinterlands, where that partnership message is so important, and development is the good news story. That's why the embassies love to get content from USAID. It's the good news, feel-good story about a ribbon cutting at a school or investments in an HIV/AIDS clinic. But it's severely, there's a severe disparity between the two, and I think that's just but one example. Okay, Jonathan, do you want to go up and use the microphone, please? Thanks, Eric.
By the way, we should be on Instagram. That's how I track my teenagers. The 150 account needs to get on Instagram. It's very big.
USAID is on Instagram. Took
Yeah.
us about a
So
year
it's-
to get it approved, but we finally
And
did.
on Snap now.
Jonathan.
I feel like I should be singing you guys a song. My question, just in case I get lost, is what should we stop talking about, or what should we start talking about? So I've sat through a lot of panels thinking about how do we defend aid. And it's kind of like playing a game of chess. Depending on which administration you've got in, you kind of arrange your pieces differently, but it's the same pieces on the chessboard. And actually, the world has changed a lot. If you look at the results of elections in the US and in Europe, people sense that the world has changed, and they sense it might not be good for them, but they don't necessarily know how the rest of the world has changed.
Right.
And we do know how the rest of the world has changed. Rapid urbanization in parts of the world, a huge demographic dividend available. And so how do you think, people will look at that and be like, hang on, guys, you're still playing chess with your poverty and your vaccines and your bed nets. And that was like the game of the 80s. So what should we stop talking about, because it's not relevant anymore? What should we start talking about that are new pieces on this chessboard that are reflective of the way that the world has changed, that perhaps the public don't understand and should understand?
Okay, it's a great question. Anyone want to take a shot?
I can start with just 2 very practical things that we're a group of us who are trying to do some efforts on the budget are talking about. One is lead with a commitment to U.S. security. First, you have to state it. You can't imply it. You can't be like, well, obviously I care about the security of America. You have to walk into the room and say, first and foremost, I care about the security of the United States. Then you have to say, and that's why I'm here to talk to you about the entire 150 account. Then you can get into foreign assistance or refugees or arts or whatever your third tier thing is. And I can't stress enough, we see from messaging frames, over and over again, people turn you off. They stop listening if you start with a bed net. But if you say, this is about America's security, okay? And now I'm going to talk to you about the importance of the entire breadth of the 150 account. Why is that important? Because we may save a foreign assistance budget, but if you allow public diplomacy to be completely decimated. Not that there aren't repairs that need to be made, and that's a different panel. But if you allow that to be decimated, if we start picking and choosing, basically foreign assistance is in a position that it may live today only to die tomorrow. And we need to, and it can't work in a vacuum. We all know that. So I would just say in terms of what we do start talking about, that's one. The other one I think that's an urban legend that I would hear in political context was don't talk about climate change. Nobody cares about climate change. I think today is going to prove to a lot of people that, especially millennials, people do care about climate change. They want a planet when they grow up. So,
The one thing I would add to that is, when you talked about bed nets and sort of like things we've distributed or numbers where it sounds like we're just handouts. I think people respond better to stories that talk about self-resilience. People, hand up, and that's a lot of what we tried to do in our storytelling, and it got a good reaction. So I think it's moving people away from thinking that we're just handing things out to, okay, so bed nets, what did that mean for this family? Maybe did their daughter get to go to school? What did it mean for the community? Sort of talking about it that way and talking really about how it is a private-public partnership. It's not just aid money that's out there working.
that's a really important point. I think how many press releases did you rewrite that's led with the dollar amount and didn't lead with the purpose?
I think one other thing that Gail said this morning is really critical, and when I was on the Hill recently, this was something I talked about as well, is that we don't need to be defensive about reform. I think we can be very proactive about modernization and be specific, though. Talk specifically about the reforms to modernize the agency. And I think that's something that Gail did very well when she said, this is not your father's, not your father's Oldsmobile. It's not your father's USAID. The agency has come a long way. And so I think there's no need to be defensive on that. I very much like what Maura said, I think leading with that, but I think we also have to lead with the idea that we're open to other ideas for modernization, but the agency and the community as a whole has taken a lot of steps forward to become more transparent, to use data, to use evaluations, to make sound decisions. That resonates with everyone. Okay, yeah.
Can I just throw
sure,
one other frame for a way to think about it is we shouldn't be talking about values without linking them to our interests. I mean, I think you can keep talking about programs that benefit women in the developing world by pointing out that this is actually what leads to stability, which further down the line means we're less likely to be militarily involved in a place like Somalia, or what have you. So, but we shouldn't just throw it out there as and I think the same goes for climate change, which can be a fraught phrase right now. But if you talk about deforestation and you talk about the impact of that on the local economy and how that's going to lead to refugees or IDPs, that's a more concrete, interest-based approach. And I think so we can talk about the same things, but maybe let's link them to our interests rather than just talking about values.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Mark Swikart. I'm Senior Director of Education Protection at Plan International, USA. I just had one observation and then I had a question. It seemed interesting that every time you asked the question about how do we talk to the American people, the conversation shifted back to how do we talk to the Hill. And I don't think we really have gotten to that because every time we go back to the Hill. So one of the things that started initially is the idea of appealing to the heart, appealing to people's good nature, this idea of fairness. I find it very hard to believe in this political environment that suddenly America has become a more hateful, selfish place. Some people are that, and they have kind of gotten into the forefront. But I think that there is something to be said about who we were as Americans that's still there. And I think that when we go to the question about justifying it to a family in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the same mistake that was made in the election, I think shouldn't be repeated in our messaging when it comes to development. I think the idea that most Americans believe in fairness, of treating their fellow man fairly, there's sort of this Christian ethic and another religious thinking about how we should be as human beings. And I think your comments about certain storytelling do appeal to people because we're not suddenly ugly people. So I think, in my mind, every reason that I became involved in development was for those reasons, and I think that it appeals to most Americans. So I wonder why, and I also feel that the election has told us that people don't really pay attention to facts. They react on gut. So I think, in my mind, my question to you is that why don't we put more energy into appealing to people's gut, heart, their sense of fairness? Because that's, in fact, why I think the election turned out the way it did. That neoliberal policies of the Democrats really didn't appeal
Okay.
to the gut and heart.
It's a good question. I'm actually going to turn that over to Stephanie first, because I actually think a lot of what Stephanie tried to do at AID was exactly that, to appeal, I hate that term, hearts and minds, but I do think it was to appeal to the heart. It was a very different way of humanizing AID's work. So
Yeah, a couple points on it. It is, Ellen, it is what we were trying to do. And I will tell you a story about the first time we tried to do it. We did 2 video projects, one in India and one in Ethiopia, and it was on child and maternal survival. And what we did is we found young mothers, and we stayed with them for several days, and all of the interventions were there. There was the hand washing, there was the vaccine, there was the birth attendant, all of that was there. And I came back with what I thought were these amazing videos, like really showing what this means to this mother and this family. And the Global Health Bureau, I don't know if there's anyone here from Global Health, completely freaked out. And sort of fell back on, you didn't talk about the number of trained birth attendants. You didn't talk about how many vaccines we've given. You didn't say how many children die every minute from whatchamacallit. Like, I thought it was a pretty subtle change, but it just had a very fierce reaction to it. I mean, we eventually kept with it, and after a while we got some momentum around the effort and kind of proved that it works. But I do think there's a danger and a tendency where there's some people out there in groups trying new things that everyone just, I remember before I left, there was a meeting and everyone's like, well, we'll just go back to the messaging we used 8 years ago. I'm like, please don't do that. Please don't ignore 8 years of progress, and stop being so defensive about it. I mean, I always, like, when we had a campaign, it was to end extreme poverty, and I was like, I don't want to end extreme poverty. I want to know what's going to happen. So we had an extreme possibilities campaign. So stop with the what we're not and talk about what we are, what the values are, and kind of what Gail said. I mean, there's a project right now, I don't know if people know about it, it's called USA Facts. Steve Ballmer started it, and the idea is to be as transparent as possible about where your tax dollars are spent. And they're actually trying to write a 10K form, which is the form public companies submit to Securities and Exchange Commission. They're trying to write one for the federal government. But it's an interesting model because it's not saying don't merge us with state, don't do this, don't do that. It's making a business case for moving forward. So I worry about the defensiveness. I kind of got off track on your question. I think in the American public, it's a really diverse crowd, and I don't, everyone here always wanted us to have one message that we could tie up in a bow and say, this is it, this has got everyone. I don't think you can. I think you've got to segment your audience. You have to look at who you're talking to. Who are you talking to that it's going to be really hard to get? Maybe we're moving them to neutral. Who do we have on our side we need to activate? Who's in the middle? Les talked about this a little bit as well, but I just don't think you can try. I think an effort to try and talk to the American public all at once is just not going to work.
I think some of this, Mark, comes back to a resource issue that I've long said. I mean, I think about it as a political campaign. You go on the air in a political campaign, and right after you put your ad up, if it's a good ad, you see your favorable numbers go up. You see your name recognition go up by 10, 15 percentage points, and then you go off the air for a week, and you kind of go back down. So it has to be a sustained effort, and I think that's one of the challenges that this community has had. Not just when I say community, I don't mean aid. I mean as us in the implementing partner community. The NGOs are much more out there. CARE, World Vision, others, they can advocate because their money is not exclusively coming from the U.S. government. But I think one of the challenges is just a resource challenge to get out to all 50 states. It's something that, again, U.S. Global Leadership Campaign does phenomenally, but on a smaller scale. But to have the kind of, I think, huge impact to move the needle on foreign aid that we need to move, that takes tremendous resources, right? And sometimes I sit back and I think, we really have to rely on Congress to make the right decisions. They're going to take input from their constituents, of course, and if it means losing the election, they're probably not going to put their neck out there. But I think on this issue, in some ways, we really have to have faith in some folks on the Hill that have studied this issue very hard, that they're going to make the right decision on foreign aid, because I'm not sure that we really, as a community right now, have the resources to go out there and fundamentally move American public opinion. I could be wrong. I don't know what more.
I would just say, I mean, for about 10 years, I've focused on, like, how do we get more people in America to care about foreign policy just through my various jobs. And, I last week alone, I had 3 meetings on, we're going to do a road show and bring some more scholars out to Indiana to teach people why, this is important or that's important, why the Transatlantic Alliance or the, whatever it is. I haven't seen those move the needle. But I think your question of appealing to emotion is the right one. We did learn that lesson from the election. And I went to a meeting yesterday, and I think those things, you get things from every meeting that sort of sit and marinate with you. One thing that someone raised was all of this can fit under, again, I talked about the year or so we have to sort of, people are sort of mushy and aren't threatened and polarized because we're not in an election cycle right now, that they're absorbing things, is really putting the question on the table about what kind of future they want. So we're all getting overloaded with this is wrong, the sky is falling, oh my gosh, like all of these things. But reframing it and maybe turning it around and saying, let's choose the future we want. And, do we want to be the country that people look at us and don't want us to come to the party? Or do we want to be the country that, helped transform lives? Do we want to, and, sort of trying to frame it in a more positive way, that may end up, having, and then you can dig down under that as you micro-target and go into different communities, but sort of keeping that overarching frame of choosing our future.
And I think just to add to that, I like that frame. We also have to think about the execution of it. So if I look at millennials today, millennials would never get their information or news from a roadshow.
Right.
They grew up with fake news and native advertising and stuff. Their trusted sources are each other. So I literally did a focus group once right before I got here with millennial women, and the moderator, it was on reproductive health, and the moderator sat there and said, Texas is passing this law that's going to defund Planned Parenthood, blah, 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 and this is going to happen. They all sat there. Someone in the group said, oh, in Arizona, they're blah, 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 because it came from one of their peers, outrage. Pure outrage. And so that was a big insight in that campaign, and learning that we're not going to be able to do what we have always done and think it's going to get through. We're going to have to, we're going to have to figure out digital, and I'm sick of signing up for social media accounts, but we're going to have to sign up for whatever the next Snapchat or whatever comes out. I'm sure it's already there. Like, we're just going to have to keep evolving with this landscape, or it's never going to happen. I know there was an ongoing debate in legislative and public affairs about front lines. Does anybody know what front lines is? Yeah. It used to be an actual, it's got fans. It used to be an actual paper that got held out. And so, I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at limited budgets. Do I know that front lines makes a lot of sense anymore? We moved it online to save money, but there's no numbers there to support it. So, I see cringing faces because people love front lines, but at some point we have to let front lines go, and we have to move over to Medium, which got
a lot of money to spend on
followers for us. And it's the same type of story, but we have to be willing to say, this doesn't cut it anymore.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I know it's
You want to come on up? Yep. You've had your hand up for a while.
Philip Lowry, I'm an ensign with the United States Navy. I have a question about your messaging, and it correlates to the military. So when the military frames its message, it places a great deal of emphasis not only on the mission, but the people serving as well, and that appeals a lot to the American people. Mm-hmm. Has there been a discussion about reframing your message to create, I guess, more of a challenge to the American people, not just we're going out and doing things, but come with me to go out and change the world?
Yeah,
That's great.
I agree with your question. I've asked that too. You're right. You're correct.
Yeah.
We saw during Ebola, which we could get no one to pay any attention to when it first happened. The one thing that got people to pay attention a little bit, and then we moved from there, was we actually hired a videographer who happened to be on the ground in Liberia. She told the story of a young nurse named Audrey, who was basically from Central Casting, talking about why, as an American, she came over there to work in one of the Ebola units. From there, we started interviewing and profiling members of the military and the DART team that were deployed. That's the only thing that ever got traction. Those were the stories. So we have started to do that and sort of invest in telling those stories. The challenge is, and this might be a bigger challenge for the community, is as USAID, there's really nothing you can come do to volunteer and help me. Like,
Yeah.
we could put a call out there. We put a call out there for medical workers during Ebola, and it was a disaster because we had to then figure out how do we triage all of these applications coming. We're not set up to do that, and the lawyers will have a fit. So we can put that call out there. I think it makes sense, but the community is going to then have to figure out what can these people actually do to help, because unfortunately we're not going to be able to send most of them to Ghana on the ground. So we have to collectively figure out that solution.
Okay, I think that's it for questions, because I got the 5-minute mark. I want to give the panelists just a chance to offer any kind of closing last thoughts. I know there's a lot we did not get to. I'd hoped to get a little bit more into reform messaging and modernization messaging, which we did not. We could spend a few hours here. So, anyone? Closing thoughts. Les, do you want to start?
Real quick on why we keep talking about Congress. To your question, I think it's an incredibly efficient and convenient way to talk to the American people. Congress every Thursday or Friday flies back to every single state in the country and most of the neighborhoods and talks to actual Americans and humans on the ground. They're doing it anyway. And then they come back here and all work in 6 different buildings right down there on Capitol Hill. It's an easy way to go talk to the American people is talking to Congress. So if you've got a tough budget, hire some more legislative affairs officers and tell good stories on the Hill. I also think as we kind of wrap it up, let's not forget the 150 has a great constituency in this country. We keep convincing ourselves that we don't have a constituency and it's not quite as good as the armed services, which may be true, but we have a constituency, whether it's a church that's involved in doing relief work through one of our NGOs, or if it's the American Legion, where someone's going to go talk about their experiences in Iraq or Afghanistan and kind of talk about what the PRT was doing. We have resources back in real America. We should listen to them. We should also avoid getting too political and preaching to people about whatever our view is of whatever the hot social issue is. People don't like being preached to. We should avoid doing that from whatever side we're on, and we should talk about how we're delivering for the American people in an efficient and effective way. They want to hear that message, and they're going to like hearing it.
I've gotten to the point, I've spent a lot of meetings sort of like, what's the message for you? How are we going to change things? So I get frustrated the ones where we all discuss this for an hour and sort of walk out of the room and don't have a plan. So I'm going to propose one. And that would be that for any of you that are at organizations that operate in this space, take the tremendous amount of time and energy it will take to tell the story of one of the people that are serving on behalf of your organization. Through a video, having them write a Medium post, having them post their pictures in an Instagram series or do an Instagram takeover, a lot of different ways, but have them first person, tell the story of that individual. The second is to go on Facebook and stay committed to explaining to people on Facebook. The reason I say Facebook, that's like the internet, and that's where people are hearing. We know this. We know that's where people are absorbing because they're hearing it from friends and things like that. And take the time once a week to look at something in the news and say, let me use it as an opportunity to tell people why these issues are important, why national security and development and prioritizing these issues are important. So those are my just 2 very tangible requests.
There's our plan. Let's write that up. Thanks, Maura.
So I see 1 minute, and I'm going to be very selfish about this because I actually see a few members of my old team at USAID who are still here, still working hard. So on their behalf, I'm going to continue to make an ask I used to make all the time when I talk to people. 1, please can we start to walk away from the crazy acronyms? There's really a chance to communicate through these project names. It is actually an opportunity we miss when we come up with, and some of them are super clever, and I understand they take hours to come up with, but they don't communicate anything, and they don't do
Spice, Dragon, do any of those sound
There's
familiar?
literally was a Project Crap with a K in the Ukraine. Like, number 1 on that. Second one is, a lot of you probably know, and have probably heard me talk about it before, we redid the branding guidelines. They're working really hard to enforce them, and it is a huge time commitment from that team up there, because there isn't anyone that focuses just on branding. So for the best of your ability, please follow the branding guidelines, so they can possibly leave before 11 o'clock on a few of these nights. It's my selfish plea.
Okay, with that, let me thank all of you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Let me thank the panel, Maura, Les, Stephanie. I think we just barely scratched the surface. There's a lot more that we could have talked about today. Maybe we need to continue this conversation. Some of us are in other forums continuing this conversation about how to message. It's a very worthwhile topic of discussion, and as I said earlier, I think it's really imperative to us as a community. If you'd like to stay on for about the next 20 minutes, there are going to be 3 breakout groups. I think one over here and maybe 2 over here. You'll see volunteers. They'll raise their hands. The volunteers want to raise their hands right now that are going to help facilitate the 3. Oh, all of these volunteers. Okay, so if you want to stick around for about the next 20 minutes and continue the conversation, please feel free. If not, there's great booths out there. So go visit. And thank you again for sitting in on this panel.